Welcome to Soft Hour Library. Tonight's story begins now. Close your eyes and rest.
Chapter 2. Our investigation of happiness has so far not taught us much that is not generally known. Nor does the prospect of learning something new seem much greater if we continue it with the question why it is so hard for people to be happy. We have already given the answer by pointing to the three sources from which our suffering comes: the superior power of nature, the frailty of our own bodies, and the inadequacy of the arrangements that regulate the relations of human beings in the family, the state, and society. Regarding the first two, our judgment need not hesitate long. It forces us to acknowledge these sources of suffering and to resign ourselves to the inevitable. We will never completely master nature, our organism, itself a part of this nature, will always remain a transient, limited structure in adaptation and performance. This recognition has no paralyzing effect. On the contrary, it points the direction for our activity. If we cannot remove all suffering, we can remove some and alleviate others. Many thousand-year experience has convinced us of this. We behave differently toward the third, the social source of suffering. We do not want to acknowledge this one at all. We cannot understand why the institutions we ourselves have created should not rather be protection and benefit for us all. However, when we consider how poorly we have succeeded in precisely this piece of prevention of suffering, the suspicion awakens that here too a piece of unconquerable nature could be at work behind it. This time our own psychical nature. On the way to occupying ourselves with this possibility, we encounter an assertion so astonishing that we must linger with it. It states that a great part of the blame for our misery is borne by our so-called civilization. We would be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this astonishing because, however one may define the concept of culture, it is certain that everything with which we try to protect ourselves against the threat from the sources of suffering belongs precisely to that same culture. By what path have so many people come to this standpoint of strange hostility to culture? I believe a deep, long-standing dissatisfaction with the prevailing state of culture provided the soil on which a condemnation then arose on certain historical occasions. I believe I can recognize the last and the penultimate of these occasions. I am not learned enough to trace the chain of them far enough back into the history of the human species. Already at the victory of Christianity over the pagan religions, such a culture-hostile factor must have been involved. It stood very close, after all, to the devaluation of earthly life accomplished by Christian doctrine. The penultimate occasion arose when, through the progress of voyages of discovery, contact was made with primitive peoples and tribes. Through insufficient observation and misunderstanding of their customs and manners, they seemed to Europeans to lead a simple, happy life with few needs, unattainable to their culturally superior visitors. Later experience has corrected much of this judgment. In many cases, the measure of life facilitation that was to be thanked to nature's generosity and the convenience in satisfying the great needs had been mistakenly attributed to the absence of complicated cultural demands. The last occasion is particularly familiar to us. It arose when people came to know the mechanism of the neuroses that threaten to undermine the bit of happiness of the civilized person. It was found that a person becomes neurotic because he cannot tolerate the degree of frustration that society imposes on him in the service of its cultural ideals. And it was concluded from this that abolishing or greatly reducing these demands would mean a return to possibilities of happiness. There is also a factor of disappointment. In the last generations, people have made extraordinary progress in the natural sciences and their technical application, and have established their mastery over nature in a previously unimaginable way. The details of these advances are generally known. It is unnecessary to enumerate them. People are proud of these achievements and have a right to be. But they believe they have noticed that this newly won control over space and time, this subjugation of the forces of nature, the fulfillment of age-old yearnings, has not increased the measure of pleasure satisfaction they expect from life, has not made them feel happier. One should be content to conclude from this observation that power over nature is not the only condition of human happiness, just as it is not the only goal of cultural endeavors, and not derive from it the worthlessness of technical progress for our happiness economy. One would like to object, is it not a positive gain of pleasure, an unambiguous increase in happiness feeling? If I can hear the voice of my child as often as I wish, living hundreds of kilometers away from me, if shortly after my friend's landing I can learn that he has survived the long, difficult journey well, does it mean nothing that medicine has succeeded in enormously reducing the mortality of small children, the danger of infection for women giving birth, indeed in considerably prolonging the average lifespan of civilized man? And we can cite a long series of such benefits that we owe to the much maligned age of scientific and technical progress. But here, the voice of pessimistic criticism makes itself heard, warning that most of these satisfactions follow the pattern of that cheap pleasure praised in a certain anecdote. One procures this pleasure by sticking one's bare leg out from under the covers on a cold winter night, and then pulling it back in. If there were no railway to overcome distances, the child would never have left his hometown. One would need no telephone to hear his voice. If ocean navigation had not been established, the friend would not have undertaken the sea voyage. I would not need the telegraph to allay my concern about him. What use is the reduction of child mortality to us if it forces us to practice extreme restraint in procreation, so that on the whole we are not raising more children than in the times before the reign of hygiene, but have brought our sexual life in marriage under difficult conditions and probably worked against the beneficial natural selection? And finally, what use to us is a long life if it is difficult, poor in joys, and so full of suffering that we can only welcome death as a deliverer? It seems certain that we do not feel comfortable in our present-day culture, but it is very difficult to form a judgment whether and to what extent the people of earlier times felt happier, and what role their cultural conditions played in this. We will always have the tendency to grasp misery objectively. That is, to place ourselves with our demands and sensibilities into those conditions, and then examine what occasions for happiness and unhappiness we would find in them. This way of looking at things, which appears objective because it abstracts from the variations of subjective sensitivity, is naturally the most subjective possible, since it substitutes for all other unknown mental disposition one's own. But happiness is something thoroughly subjective. However much we may recoil from certain situations, that of the ancient galley slave, of the peasant in the 30 Years' War, of the victim of the Holy Inquisition, of the Jew awaiting the pogrom, it is nevertheless impossible for us to feel our way into these persons, to guess the changes that original obtuseness, gradual numbing, cessation of expectations, cruder and finer modes of narcotization have brought about in the receptivity to pleasure and unpleasure sensations. In the case of extreme possibility of suffering, certain mental protective mechanisms also go into operation. It seems to me fruitless to pursue this side of the problem further. It is time that we concern ourselves with the nature of this culture, whose happiness value is questioned. We will not demand a formula that expresses this nature in a few words before we have learned anything from investigation. It suffices us, therefore, to repeat that the word culture designates the entire sum of achievements and institutions that distinguish our life from that of our animal ancestors and serve two purposes: the protection of man against nature and the regulation of the relations of men to one another. To understand more, we will gather together the features of culture individually as they show themselves in human communities. In doing so, we allow ourselves without hesitation to be guided by linguistic usage, or as one also says, linguistic feeling, trusting that we thereby do justice to inner insights that still resist expression in abstract words. The beginning is easy. We recognize as cultural all activities and values that benefit people by making the earth serviceable to them, protecting them against the violence of natural forces, and the like. About this side of culture, there is the least doubt. To go back far enough, the first cultural acts were the use of tools, the taming of fire, the building of dwellings. Among these, the taming of fire stands out as a quite extraordinary, unprecedented achievement, while with the others man struck out on path that he has since continued to follow, the stimulus for which is easy to guess. With all his tools, man perfects his organs, both motor and sensory, or removes the barriers to their performance. Motors place enormous forces at his disposal, which like his muscles he can send in any direction. The ship and the airplane see to it that neither water nor air can hinder his movement. With spectacles he corrects the defects of the lens in his eye. With the telescope he looks into distant spaces. With the microscope he overcomes the limits of visibility set by the structure of his retina. In the photographic camera, he has created an instrument that captures the fleeting visual impressions, which the gramophone record must do for the equally transitory sound impressions, both fundamentally materializations of his power of memory. His recall. With the help of the telephone, he hears from distances that even fairy tales would respect as unattainable. Writing is originally the voice of the absent, the dwelling house a substitute for the mother's womb, the first dwelling, in which one was safe and felt so comfortable, probably still longed for. It sounds not just like a fairy tale. It is the direct fulfillment of of most fairy tale wishes. What man through his science and technology has brought about on this earth, on which he first appeared as a feeble animal being, and on which every individual of his species must enter again as a helpless infant. O inch of nature! All this property he may claim as cultural acquisition. Long ago he had formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience, which he embodied in his gods. To them he attributed everything that seemed unattainable to his wishes, or was forbidden to him. One may therefore say that these gods were cultural ideals. Now he has approached very close to the attainment of this ideal, has almost become a god himself. Of course, only as people generally tend to attain ideals according to human judgment. Not completely. In some respects, not at all. In others, only halfway. Man has become a kind of prosthetic god, so to speak, quite magnificent when he puts on all his auxiliary organs. But they have not grown onto him, and still give him much trouble on occasion. Moreover, he has a right to console himself that this development will not be concluded precisely with the year 1930. Distant times will bring new, probably unimaginably great advances in this field of culture, will further increase his godlikeness. But in the interest of our investigation, we also want not to forget that present-day man does not feel happy in his godlikeness. We therefore recognize the cultural level of a country when we find that everything in it is cultivated and expedient that serves man's exploitation of the earth and his protection against the forces of nature. In short, is useful to him. In such a country, let rivers that threaten with floods be regulated in their course, their water channeled through canals to where it is needed. The soil should be carefully tilled and planted with the vegetation it is suited to bear. The mineral treasures of the deep should be diligently brought to the surface and fashioned into the required tools and implements. The means of transportation should be plentiful, swift, and reliable. Wild and dangerous animals should be exterminated. The breeding of domesticated animals should flourish. But we have yet other demands to make on culture, and remarkably hope to see them realized in these same countries. As if we wanted to deny our first-raised demand, we also greet it as cultural when we see that people's care also extends to things that are utterly useless, even appear rather unnecessary. For example, when the garden areas in a city necessary as playgrounds and air reservoirs also bear flower beds, or when the windows of the dwellings are decorated with flower pots, we soon notice that the useless thing whose high valuation we expect from culture is beauty. We demand that the civilized man revere beauty where he encounters it in nature, and produce it on objects insofar as his hand's work is capable. Far from our demands on culture being thereby exhausted, we still want to see the signs of cleanliness and order. We do not think highly of the culture of an English country town in Shakespeare's time, when we read that a large dunghill lay before the door of his father's house in Stratford. We are indignant and call it barbaric, the opposite of cultural. When we find the paths of the Vienna woods strewn with discarded papers, filth of any kind seems to us incompatible with culture. We also extend the demand for cleanliness to the human body. Hear with astonishment what evil odor the person of the Roi Soleil used to emit, and shake our heads when we are shown on Isola Bella the tiny wash basin that Napoleon used for his morning toilet. Indeed, We are not surprised when someone sets up the use of soap directly as a measure of culture. It is similar with order, which, like cleanliness, refers entirely to human works. But while we cannot expect cleanliness in nature, order is rather copied from nature. The observation of the great astronomical regularities has given man not only the model, but also the first starting points for introducing order into his life. Order is a kind of compulsion to repeat which, through a single regulation, decides when, where, and how something is to be done, so that in every similar case, one is spared hesitation and wavering. The benefit of order is quite undeniable. It enables man the best exploitation of space and time, while sparing his mental forces. One would have a right to expect that it would establish itself in human activity spontaneously and without difficulty from the beginning. And one may be astonished that this is not the case. That man rather shows a natural propensity to carelessness, irregularity, and unreliability in his work, and must laboriously be trained to imitate the heavenly models. Beauty, cleanliness, and order obviously occupy a special position among the cultural requirements. No one will maintain that they are as vital as the mastery of the forces of nature and other factors, yet to be learned about. And yet no one would like to relegate them to the background as inessentials. That culture is not solely concerned with utility is already shown by the example of beauty, which we do not want to be missing among the interests of culture. The utility of order is quite obvious. With cleanliness, we must bear in mind that it is also demanded by hygiene. And we may surmise that this connection was not entirely foreign to man, even before the era of scientific disease prevention. But utility does not fully explain the striving for it. Something else must be in play. Yet by no other feature do we believe we can better characterize culture than by the valuation and cultivation of the higher mental activities, of intellectual, scientific, and artistic achievements, of the leading role accorded to ideas in human life. Foremost among these ideas are the religious systems, on whose complicated structure I have attempted elsewhere to shed light. Alongside them the philosophical speculations, and finally what one can call the ideal formations of mankind. Their conceptions of a possible perfection of the individual person, of the people, of the whole of humanity, and the demand they raise on the basis of such conceptions, that these creations are not independent of one another, but rather intimately interwoven with one another, makes both their presentation and their psychological derivation more difficult. If we quite generally assume that the driving force of all human activities is the striving toward the two confluent goals of utility and gain of pleasure, we must allow this to apply here too, although it is easily apparent only for scientific and artistic activity. But one cannot doubt that the others also correspond to strong needs of man, perhaps such as are developed only in a minority. Nor should one be led astray by value judgments about individual ones of these religious, philosophical systems and these ideals, whether one seeks the highest achievement of the human spirit in them, or deplores them as aberrations. One must acknowledge that their presence, especially their predominance, signifies a high standard of culture. As a last certainly not unimportant characteristic of a culture. We must value the way in which the relationships of people to one another are regulated, the social relationships that affect man as neighbor, as auxiliary force, as sexual object of another, as member of a family, of a state. Here it becomes especially difficult to keep oneself free from certain ideal demands and to grasp what is cultural in general. Perhaps one begins with the explanation that the cultural element is given with the first attempt to regulate these social relationships. If no such attempt were made, these relationships would be subject to the arbitrariness of the individual. That is, the physically stronger would decide them in the sense of his interests and drive impulses. Nothing would change even if this stronger one in turn met an even stronger individual. Human communal life first becomes possible when a majority comes together that is stronger than any individual and holds together against every individual. The power of this community then confronts as law the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. This replacement of the power of the individual by that of the community is the decisive cultural step. Its essence consists in the members of the community restricting themselves in their possibilities of satisfaction, while the individual knew no such barrier. The next cultural requirement is therefore that of justice. That is, the assurance that the legal order once established shall not be broken in favor of an individual. The ethical value of such law is not decided hereby. The further path of cultural development seems to tend toward making this law no longer the expression of the will of a small community, caste, population stratum, tribal stock, which in turn behaves toward other and perhaps more comprehensive such masses like a violent individual. The final result should be a law to which all, at least all those capable of community, have contributed through their drive sacrifices and which leaves none, again with the same exception, as a victim of brute force. Individual freedom is not a cultural good. It was greatest before any culture, although then mostly without value, because the individual was scarcely in a position to defend it. Through cultural development, it experiences restrictions, and justice demands that these restrictions be spared no one. What stirs in a human community as a freedom impulse may be rebellion against an existing injustice, and so prove favorable to further cultural development. Remain compatible with culture, but it can also spring from the remnant of the original personality unbridled by culture, and so become the basis of hostility to culture. The freedom impulse is thus directed against particular forms and claims of culture, or against culture itself. It does not appear that man can through any influence be brought to transform his nature into that of a termite. He will probably always defend his claim to individual freedom against the will of the mass. Much of mankind's struggle concentrates on the single task of finding an expedient. That is, happiness-making balance between these individual and cultural mass claims. One of its fateful problems is whether this balance is achievable through a particular form of culture, or whether the conflict is irreconcilable. By allowing ourselves to be told by common feeling which features in human life should be called cultural, we have gotten a clear impression of the total picture of culture, though admittedly at first learned nothing that is not generally known. At the same time, We have guarded against agreeing with the prejudice that culture is equivalent to perfection. Is the path to perfection prescribed for man? But now a view forces itself upon us that perhaps leads elsewhere. Cultural development appears to us as a peculiar process that runs over mankind, and much about it strikes us as familiar. This process we can characterize by the changes it makes with the known human drive dispositions, whose satisfaction is after all the economic task of our life. Some of these drives are used up in such a way that something appears in their place that we describe in the individual as a character trait. The most remarkable example of this process we have found in the anal eroticism of the young human being. His original interest in the excretory function, its organs and products, transforms itself in the course of growth into the group of traits known to us as thrift, sense of order and cleanliness, which, valuable and welcome in themselves, can intensify to conspicuous dominance and then produce what is called the anal character. How this happens we do not know, but the correctness of this view is beyond doubt. Now we have found that order and cleanliness are essential cultural demands, although their vital necessity is not exactly evident, any more than their suitability as sources of pleasure. At this point, the similarity of the cultural process with the libido development of the individual must first have struck us. Other drives are induced to shift the conditions of their satisfaction, to direct them onto other paths, which in most cases coincides with the well-known sublimation of drive aims. In others can still be separated from it. Drive sublimation is an especially prominent feature of cultural development. It makes it possible for higher mental activities, scientific, artistic, ideological, to play such a significant role in cultural life. If one yields to the first impression, one is tempted to say that sublimation is altogether a drive destiny forced by culture. But one does better to think about this longer. Thirdly and finally, and this seems the most important, it is impossible to overlook the extent to which culture is built upon drive renunciation. How much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction suppression, repression, or something else of powerful drives. This cultural frustration dominates the great field of social relationships of men. We already know it is the cause of the hostility against which all cultures have to fight. It will also make heavy demands on our scientific work. We have much to clarify there. It is not easy to understand how one can make it possible to deprive a drive of satisfaction. It is by no means safe if it is not economically compensated. One can prepare for serious disturbances. But if we want to know what value our conception of cultural development as a special process, comparable with the normal maturation of the individual, may claim, we must obviously attack another problem. Must ask ourselves what influences cultural development owes its origin to, how it arose, and what determined its course. Chapter 3. This task seems oversized. One may confess one's timidity. Here is the little that I was able to guess. After primeval man had discovered that it was, literally understood, in his hand to improve his lot on earth through work, it could not be a matter of indifference to him whether another person worked with or against him. The other gained for him the value of the fellow worker with whom it was useful to live. Even earlier, in his ape-like prehistory, he had adopted the habit of forming families. The members of the family were probably his first helpers. Presumably, the founding of the family was connected with the fact that the need for genital satisfaction no longer appeared like a guest who suddenly shows up and, after his departure, lets nothing more be heard of himself for a long time, but settled down as a permanent lodger with the individual. With this, the male acquired a motive to keep the female, or more generally, the sexual objects, near him. The females, who did not want to separate from their helpless young, also had to remain with the stronger male in their interest. In this primitive family, we still miss an essential feature of culture. The arbitrariness of the head and father was unrestricted. In Totem and Taboo, I have tried to show the path that led from this family to the next stage of communal life in the form of fraternal clans. In overpowering the father, the sons had made the experience that a union can be stronger than the individual. The totemic culture rests on the restrictions that they had to impose on one another to maintain the new state. The taboo prescriptions were the first law. Human communal life was thus doubly founded by the compulsion to work created by external necessity, and by the power of love, which on the part of the man did not want to do without the sexual object in the woman, and on the part of the woman did not want to do without that piece separated from her. The child, Eros and Anak, thus also became the parents of human culture. The first cultural success was that a larger number of people could now remain in community. And since both great powers worked together in this, one might expect that further development would proceed smoothly toward ever better mastery of the external world, as well as toward further extension of the number of people comprised by the community. Nor is it easy to understand how this culture could act otherwise than happily upon its participants. Before we yet investigate where a disturbance can come from, let us be distracted by the recognition of love as one of the foundations of culture to fill in a gap in an earlier discussion. We said that the experience that sexual genital love gives man the strongest satisfaction experiences actually provides him the prototype for all happiness, must have suggested it to continue seeking happiness satisfaction in life, also on the field of sexual relationships, to place genital eroticism at the center of life. We continued that in this way one makes oneself dependent in a most precarious manner on a piece of the external world, namely on the chosen love object, and exposes oneself to the greatest suffering if one is spurned by it, or loses it through unfaithfulness or death. The wise men of all ages have therefore emphatically warned against this way of life. Nevertheless, it has not lost its attraction for a large number of human children. A small minority is enabled by their constitution to find happiness nonetheless on the path of love, whereby far-reaching mental modifications of the love function are indispensable. These persons make themselves independent of the object's consent by shifting the main value from being loved to their own loving. They protect themselves against its loss by directing their love not onto individual objects, but in equal measure onto all people. And they avoid the fluctuations and disappointments of genital love by deflecting it from its sexual aim, transforming the drive into an aim-inhibited impulse. What they thereby bring about in themselves, the state of an evenly hovering, unwavering, tender feeling, no longer has much outward resemblance to the stormily agitated genital love life, from which it is nevertheless derived. Saint Francis of Assisi may have gone furthest in thus exploiting love for the inner happiness feeling, what we recognize as one of the techniques of fulfilling the pleasure principle has also been related to religion, with which it may be connected in those remote regions where the distinction of the ego from objects and of these from one another is neglected. An ethical consideration, whose deeper motivation will yet become apparent to us, wants to see in this readiness for universal love of men and the world the highest attitude to which man can raise himself. We would like not to withhold our two main reservations already at this point. A love that does not select seems to us to forfeit a part of its own value by doing an injustice to the object. And further, not all people are worthy of love. The love that founded the family continues to be effective in culture in its original form, in which it does not renounce direct sexual satisfaction, and in its modification as aim-inhibited tenderness. In both forms, it continues its function of binding a larger number of people to one another in a more intensive way than is accomplished by the interest of the work community. The carelessness of language in the use of the word love finds a genetic justification. One calls the relationship between man and woman, who have founded a family on the basis of their genital needs, love. But one also calls the positive feelings between parents and children, between siblings in the family, love. Although we must describe this relationship as aim-inhibited love, as tenderness. Aim-inhibited love was indeed originally fully sensual love, and still is so in man's unconscious. Both, fully sensual and aim-inhibited love, reach beyond the family and create new bonds with previously strange people. Genital love leads to new family formations, aim-inhibited love to friendships, which become culturally important because they escape many restrictions of genital love. For example, its exclusiveness. But in the course of development, the relationship of love to culture loses its unambiguity. On the one hand, love opposes the interests of culture. On the other hand, culture threatens love with severe restrictions. This estrangement seems unavoidable. Its reason is not immediately recognizable. It first expresses itself as a conflict between the family and the larger community to which the individual belongs. We have already guessed that it is one of culture's main endeavors to bind people together into large units. But the family will not release the individual. The more intimate the cohesion of family members is, the more they are often inclined to cut themselves off from others, the more difficult their entry into the wider circle of life becomes. The phylogenetically older, in childhood alone existing manner of communal life defends itself against being superseded by the later acquired cultural one. Detachment from the family becomes a task for every young person, in solving which society often supports him through puberty and initiation rites. One gains the impression that these are difficulties inherent in all psychical, indeed fundamentally in all organic, development. Furthermore, the women soon enter into opposition to the cultural current and unfold their retarding and restraining influence. The same women who at first laid the foundation of culture through the demands of their life. Women represent the interests of the family and sexual life. The work of culture has become increasingly the business of men, poses ever more difficult tasks to them, compels them to drive sublimations of which women are little capable. Since man does not have unlimited quantities of psychical energy at his disposal, he must accomplish his tasks by an expedient distribution of libido. What he uses for cultural purposes he largely withdraws from women and sexual life. His constant association with men, his dependence on relations with them, even estrange him from his duties as husband and father. Thus the woman sees herself pushed into the background by the claims of culture and enters into a hostile relationship with it. From the side of culture, the tendency toward restricting sexual life is no less clear than the other toward extending the cultural circle. Already the first cultural phase, that of totemism, brings with it the prohibition of incestuous object choice. Perhaps the most drastic mutilation that human love life has ever experienced in the course of time. Through taboo, law, and custom, further restrictions are established that affect both men and women. Not all cultures go equally far in this. The economic structure of society also influences the measure of remaining sexual freedom. We already know that culture here follows the compulsion of economic necessity. Since it must withdraw from sexuality a large amount of the psychical energy it itself uses. In this, culture behaves toward sexuality like a tribe or a stratum of the population that has subjected another to its exploitation. Fear of the rebellion of the suppressed drives to stricter precautionary measures. A peak of such development is shown by our Western European culture. It is psychologically entirely justified that it begins by prescribing the manifestations of the child's sexual life. For there is no prospect of curbing the sexual desires of adults if groundwork has not been laid in childhood. But in no way can it be justified that the cultural society has gone so far as to also deny these easily demonstrable, indeed conspicuous phenomena. The object choice of the sexually mature individual is narrowed down to the opposite sex. Most extragenital satisfactions are prohibited as perversions. The demand expressed in these prohibitions for a uniform sexual life, for all disregards the inequalities in the innate and acquired sexual constitution of people, cuts off quite a number of them from sexual enjoyment, and thus becomes the source of severe injustice. The success of these restrictive measures might now be that in those who are normal, who are not constitutionally prevented from it, all sexual interest flows without loss into the channels left open. But what remains free from proscription, heterosexual genital love, is further impaired by the restrictions of legitimacy and monogamy. Present-day culture clearly gives to understand that it will permit sexual relationships only on the basis of a unique, indissoluble bond between one man and one woman, that it does not like sexuality as an independent source of pleasure, and is minded to tolerate it only as a hitherto irreplaceable source for the multiplication of human beings. This is naturally an extreme. It is well known that it has proved impracticable even for shorter periods. Only the weaklings have submitted to such an extensive intrusion into their sexual freedom, stronger natures only under a compensating condition. which may be spoken of later. Cultural society has seen itself compelled to silently condone many transgressions that, according to its statutes, it should have prosecuted. Yet one must not err in the other direction and assume that such a cultural attitude is altogether harmless, because it does not achieve all its intentions. The sexual life of civilized man is nevertheless severely damaged. It sometimes makes the impression of a function in regression, as our teeth and our head hair seem to be as organs. One is probably entitled to assume that its significance as a source of happiness feelings, thus in the fulfillment of our life purpose, has sensibly diminished. Sometimes one believes one recognizes that it is not only the pressure of culture, but something about the nature of the function itself that denies us full satisfaction and urges us onto other paths. This may be an error, it is hard to decide.